Welcome back to U.S. History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to continue talking about the 1960s. So we just left off talking about John F. Kennedy's brief presidency and what he did during that time. And we're going to move on to Lyndon Johnson, who is going to be sworn into office after Kennedy's assassination. So continuing talking about the 1960s. Specifically, today's goals are describe the major accomplishments of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, identify the legal advancements in the civil rights area, and explained how President Lyndon Johnson deepened the American commitment in Vietnam. So lots going on in the 60s. So in November 1963, President Lyndon Johnson was sworn into office after President Kennedy was assassinated. So he was vice president, and so he became president when JFK was killed. He promised to continue his goals, the previous president's goals, and expand the federal government's role. He introduced a bold vision called the Great Society, which aims to eliminate poverty and secure civil rights for all Americans. He believed that everyone should have access to a better life. So what was the Great Society? He first described his vision at a speech in May of 1964. And the Great Society included plans to rebuild cities, preserve the environment. He focused on education, poverty reduction, and civil rights. And when Congress convened in January of 1965, he and his supporters began turning those promises into reality. So this was a very ambitious reform movement in American history. And the president believed that combating racial discrimination and eliminating poverty would completely transform the nation. Johnson was a former teacher, and he believed that education was the key to solving poverty. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was one of the most important pieces of legislation passed during his presidency. It provided over $1 billion for books, library materials, and education programs, and focused on helping disadvantaged children get better educational opportunities. The Higher Education Act was also passed, providing scholarships and low-interest loans for poor students and federal funding for colleges and universities to get a new wave, a new generation of people the opportunity for better education in a way that they might not have had it otherwise. During this time period, Congress also passed consumer protection laws to improve the safety of meat and poultry. Warning labels were placed on cigarette packages to inform public about health risks. Creditors were required to practice, quote, truth in lending so that consumers understood the loan terms. So all of these safety standards put into place to protect the common people. Motor vehicles had to put safety standards to protect drivers and passengers. Environmental laws were passed to protect air and water quality. Solid waste disposal was regulated to reduce pollution, and wilderness areas were preserved and endangered species protected. So Johnson was a busy president. He also signed legislation creating the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, focusing on funding artists and scholars across the country. There was an act that authorized a corporation for public broadcasting, which led to the creation of PBS and NPR. And these public media outlets provided educational and cultural programs to all Americans. And the president believed that access to arts and culture was important for a great society. He also focused on immigration reform, overturning restrictive laws from the 1920s. And giving preference to immigrants with family ties to the United States, but allowing more immigrants in. Immigrants that had desirable skills were prioritized, and this opened the doors for new communities. Asian and Latin American immigrant communities grew significantly in the following years. He also waged war on poverty. He passed multiple acts that did things like establishing programs to help poor people find jobs, creating anti-poverty programs, providing job training for disadvantaged people, giving work experience to those who need it so that they could then go work, recruiting people to help in poor communities, and funding local organizations run by residents of poor areas to try and help these areas boost themselves. Some of his laws also provided low interest loans to farmers and people starting new businesses. Special programs brought jobs to Appalachia, which is one of the poorest regions in America, and programs were brought to Indian reservations to help Native American communities, and created more schools that respected Native American history, but also provided more education that Native Americans had not previously had access to. He passed the Social Security Act of 1965, which created medical care to pay for medical expenses for people over 65. This is still in place today. Huge progress, right? Healthcare for all for at least over the age of 65, which is often the group that can't afford healthcare. And Medicaid was created the following year to pay for medical care for the very poor. So this improved healthcare access. He also pushed for civil rights. President Johnson knew poverty could not be reduced if racial discrimination continued to block opportunities. So he pushed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress, which had been proposed by Kennedy. And this was the most far-reaching civil rights act ever passed. It banned discrimination in public accommodations and employment, prevented discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, or gender. And an equal opportunity commission was formed to actually enforce this law. And federal funding was denied to programs that permitted racial segregation. So we start using financial motivation to promote desegregation. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, prohibited poll taxes that prevented poor people from voting. Despite this, there were still a lot of methods used to prevent African Americans from voting, and so there was a march that was organized in 1965 called the Selma March, which actually turned violent where state police attacked marchers. And this event became referred to as Bloody Sunday, where images of violence appeared on television screens and in newspapers, and this brought huge amounts of support to the civil rights movement when they saw the completely unjustified discriminatory violence that was taking place in the South. So the rise of radio and TV and media really helped bring attention to the discrimination and the violence that was happening in certain places and not in other places, right? So brought attention to it. President Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as a response to this violence, and this prohibited states and local governments from passing discriminatory voting laws. Literacy tests and other barriers are outlawed, and over 250,000 African Americans registered to vote after the act was passed. By 1967, the majority of African Americans had registered to vote, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed to prohibit further discrimination in housing. So huge wave of success in the civil rights movement. Okay, and the last thing we're going to talk about is the Vietnam War. Let's see. I think I have a whole separate lesson on the Vietnam War. So we're also probably gonna watch a documentary on that. So we're gonna kind of skip to the end of Johnson's Great Society here. We'll talk about the Vietnam War in another lesson. The Great Society, of course, failed to eliminate all suffering. It's hard to think of anything that could do that, but it made a big difference. The percentage of people living below the poverty line was cut in half. Medicaid and Medicare provided health care for millions of Americans, and increased federal funding for education allowed more people to attend college, which has boosted everyone's chances of moving up in the world. And so despite its criticisms, the Great Society programs transformed American society, and many of them still continue today. We still have Medicare and Medicaid and things like that.